George Sodder was born in Tula, Sardinia, Italy in 1895. He immigrated to the United States with his older brother when he was 13 years old, but his brother went back to Italy shortly after clearing customs on Ellis Island. Throughout his life, George refused to speak about his reasons for leaving Italy, leading some people to speculate that something traumatic may have happened to him. George eventually found work on the Pennsylvania Railroad system, where he carried water and other supplies to the laborers, and he ended up moving to Smithers, West Virginia. He switched jobs to become a driver, and he even started his own trucking company, where he hauled dirt for construction and eventually freight and coal as well. One random day, George walked into a local store called the Music Box and met the owner's daughter, a woman named Jenny Cipriani. Jenny had come to the United States from Italy when she was 3 years old, and she related to George easily. They hit it off and even started dating. Eventually, George got up the nerve to pop the question, and Jenny said yes. Between 1923 and 1943, George and Jenny had 10 children and settled down in Fayetteville, West Virginia. The town was a picturesque Appalachian community with a small but significant Italian immigrant population. A county magistrate described the Sodder family as one of the most respected middle-class families around. George himself was known for having very strong opinions in almost every topic, everything from business to politics to current events. Due to his outspoken nature, George occasionally clashed with other members of the community. In particular, he strongly opposed Benito Mussolini and spoke out against the dictator, which led to heated arguments with other Italian immigrants. The Sodder family had several strange occurrences during their time in Fayetteville. For example, at one point a stranger showed up to the house to ask about hauling for George's company. He wandered around to the back of the house and told George that his fuse boxes were going to start a fire someday. George had thought that was odd because the local power company had recently told him they were in perfect condition. On a separate occasion, a man approached George and attempted to sell him life insurance. When George declined, he said, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed. You are going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." George did not take this threat seriously. Shortly before Christmas in 1945, the older Sodder children noticed a man parked behind US Highway 21. He was intently watching the younger kids as they came home from school. On Christmas Eve, the Sodders' oldest daughter, Marion, told the younger children that she had bought some new toys for them with the money from her job at the dime store. The younger kids were excited and asked Jenny if they could stay up to open some of the presents. She told them that they could stay up as long as some of the older children were also awake with them. At around 12:30 on Christmas morning, everyone was in bed after the children had opened a few of their gifts. The sound of the phone ringing woke Jenny up and she hurriedly answered it. At this point in time, the Sodders' second oldest son had joined the military and was fighting in World War II. Jenny was most likely worried that a phone call at 12:30 in the morning had something to do with her son. However, an unfamiliar female voice asked if an unfamiliar name was available. Jenny could hear laughter and clinking glasses in the background. She told the person on the other end that she had the wrong number and she hung up. As she went back to bed, she noticed the downstairs lights were still on and the curtains were open. The front door was also unlocked. She turned off the lights, closed the curtains, locked the door, and finally got back in bed. As she drifted off to sleep, she heard a loud bang on the roof and then something that sounded like rolling. Another half hour passed before Jenny was awoken again, this time by the smell of smoke. She went to find the cause of the smell and saw that George's office was on fire from the telephone and fuse box. She woke George up and he woke up the older children. The parents and 4 oldest kids escaped the house: Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr. They began frantically yelling to the younger children upstairs, but they never heard a response. They could not re-enter the house due to the stairs being on fire. Marion ran to a neighbor's house in order to call the fire department, and a driver who just so happened to be on a nearby road saw the flames, causing him to stop and call 911 as well. Both callers were initially unsuccessful for unknown reasons. It's possible that the phones they were using were simply broken. Someone was eventually able to get through to the 911 operator from a phone in the center of town. George climbed up the wall and broke open a window. He intended to use a ladder to get to the attic and rescue the younger children. However, the ladder that they normally kept in a resting spot against the wall was no longer there and was nowhere in the general vicinity. A water barrel that they wanted to use to douse the fire had frozen solid. George finally decided to pull both of his work trucks up to the house in a last-ditch effort to climb up to the attic window. Somehow, despite both vehicles working perfectly fine the previous day, neither one would start. The Sodders had exhausted every possibility. They were forced to simply stand and watch as their house burned down, with the younger children still trapped inside. The fire department took a long time to arrive because they were low on staff as a result of the war. By the time they showed up, the house was a pile of ashes and rubble. The firefighters entered the destroyed home and searched through the debris, looking specifically for the bones of the younger children. This is where different accounts start to report different stories. According to one source, the fire department did find several bone fragments and internal organs, but they declined to relate this information to the Sodder family. According to a different source, they did not find any bones at all. Modern fire professionals have stated that the fire department's search was cursory at best and had not been very thorough. The firefighters told the family that the children had most likely perished in the flames, and the fire had been so hot that their bones had burned beyond the point of being identifiable. They told George to leave the ruins undisturbed so that the state fire marshal's office could conduct a more thorough investigation, but George could not bear to look at the ashes of his home. After 4 days, he bulldozed 5 feet of dirt over the ashes so that he could convert the plot of land into a memorial garden. The local coroner held an inquest to determine the cause of the fire. It was decided that the blaze had most likely been caused by faulty wiring. On December 30th, death certificates were issued for the 5 younger children: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. The local newspaper contradicted itself in its story about the fire, stating at first that all the bodies had been found, but later claiming that only part of one body was recovered. George and Jenny refused to go to their children's funeral because they were too grief-stricken to bear it. George and Jenny began rebuilding their lives, still shocked and devastated by the horrific incident. However, it didn't take long for them to start asking questions. For example, if the fire had been caused by an electrical issue, then how had their Christmas lights remained on during the early stages of the fire? Furthermore, why was the ladder that they normally kept leaning against the side of the house eventually found at the bottom of an embankment 75 feet away? Jenny was particularly suspicious about how her children could have burned to death without leaving behind any remains. She conducted experiments of her own in which she burned various animal bones. She used chicken bones, beef joints, and pork chop bones. Every time she did this, the fire would leave behind a charred set of bones. She also knew that various household appliances had been intact enough for them to be identified. She went to a local crematorium where an employee told her that bones remain after flesh for 2 hours at 2,000 degrees. The house had burned down in 45 minutes. Suspicion would only continue to grow over time. A telephone repairman told the Sodders that their lines had been cut, not burned. A witness reported seeing a man at the house with a block and tackle, typically used to remove car engines. One day, while the family was visiting the site, they found a hard rubber object in the yard. Jenny concluded that it must have been the thing that caused the thud and rolling noises on the roof. It turned out to be a napalm pineapple bomb, which was a type of explosive that was used extensively in the Vietnam War. Before long, witnesses began reporting sightings related to the case. One woman reported having seen the missing children looking out of a car window during the fire. Another woman who had been operating a tourist stop nearby said she saw the children and served them breakfast the day after the fire. According to her, there was a car with Florida license plates at the tourist court. A woman at a Charleston hotel saw the photos of the younger children in a newspaper and reported seeing them about a week after the fire. According to her, the children were accompanied by 2 women and 2 men, all of Italian extraction. She could not remember the exact date, but the group had stayed in a large room with several beds. She had attempted to talk to the children, but the men had refused to allow her to do so. In 1947, George and Jenny sent a letter to the FBI asking about their case. J. Edgar Hoover sent a reply telling them that the case was a local matter and did not fall under the Bureau's jurisdiction. He said that the FBI could only help with the case if the local authorities agreed, but the Fayetteville police and fire departments both refused. The Sodders decided to hire a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley. Tinsley discovered that one of the jury members during the inquest to determine the cause of the fire had actually been the same insurance salesman who threatened to burn down George's house and destroy his children. He also heard a story from a Fayetteville minister that the fire chief who had said there were no remains on their property had actually recovered a heart from the ashes. According to the minister, the fire chief had buried the heart at the scene in a dynamite box. Tinsley dug up the box and took it straight to a local funeral director, who told them it was actually just beef liver. Shortly after this, the Sodders heard rumors that the fire chief had confessed to burying the beef liver in the hopes that the Sodder family would find it and think it belonged to the children. This was supposedly his way of stopping the investigation. In 1949, George saw a magazine photo of a group of young ballet dancers in New York City. One of them bore a striking resemblance to Betty. George drove all the way to the school and demanded to see the girl in person, but the school refused. In August of that same year, George persuaded a pathologist from Washington, D.C. to supervise a new search through the dirt on the property. This search was extremely thorough and turned up a dictionary that had belonged to the children, as well as several coins. The most interesting thing it turned up was a collection of bone fragments. The fragments were sent to a specialist at the Smithsonian Institution, who determined that they were human vertebrae, all from the same person. The age of this person was estimated to have been around 16 or 17 years old, which meant that the bone fragments did not belong to any of the younger Sodder children. The bones also did not show any signs of exposure to fire, and the specialist agreed that it was very strange for these to be the only bones found at the scene. In a later update, Tinsley apparently determined that the bones had come from a nearby cemetery, but he had no idea how or why they had ended up on the Sodder property. The Sodders family case gained national media attention, and the West Virginia legislature held 2 separate hearings in 1950. However, after these hearings, the governor and state police both told the Sodders that their case was hopeless, and they closed it at the state level. The FBI actually did determine that they had jurisdiction because the Sodder children might have been kidnapped on an interstate, but they ended up dropping the case after spending 2 years of hitting dead ends. Despite the apparent lack of hope in the case, the Sodder family refused to give up. They printed flyers with photos of the children and offered a $5,000 reward for any information leading to the recovery of any of them. In 1952, they erected a billboard at the site of the fire. George spent his time investigating tips in person. A woman in St. Louis, Missouri claimed that Martha was being held in a convent. A bar patron in Texas said that he heard 2 people talking about a fire they had started on Christmas Eve in West Virginia. Neither of these leads turned up anything significant. In 1967, George and his son-in-law Grover Paxton traveled to Houston, Texas to investigate yet another tip. A woman in Houston had written a letter to the Sodders claiming that Louis had revealed his true identity to her when he was drunk one night. She thought he and Maurice might be living somewhere in Texas together. The authorities helped George and Grover locate the 2 men whom the woman suspected of being Louis and Maurice, but they denied being George's children. This is a photo of the man whom the Sodder family believed was Louis. They received this picture in the mail with no return address. On the back of the picture are the words, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie." To this day, it's unknown whether or not this man actually was one of the missing Sodder children. Years after investigating this lead, Grover stated that George seriously doubted the men's denial, and the thought that they were his children lingered in his mind. In 1969, George Sodder passed away without ever getting any closure. Jenny and the rest of the children, except for John, continued to search for answers. John never spoke about the fire except to say that his family needed to move on. Jenny regularly wore black for the rest of her life and tended the memorial garden religiously. The surviving Sodder children theorized that their younger siblings had been taken by the Sicilian mafia, who may have brought them back to Italy. They also theorized that their younger siblings may have declined to contact them because they wanted to keep their family out of harm's way. In more recent years, the case has continued to get attention around the internet, especially on forums like Web Sleuths. It seems like everyone who knows about this case has their own theory on what happened to the Sodder children. Even those who believe they did die in the fire admit that there are enough strange and suspicious details to write off the case as entirely accidental. It seems clear that someone made this happen. Someone who had a personal vendetta against the Sodder family. Someone who had no conscience. Someone who was capable of ruining the lives of an entire family for their own personal gain.